In the summer of 1945, the uranium inside Little Boy, the bomb that fell on Hiroshima, passed through a barrier of nickel that was manufactured in secret by an American car parts company. That same company, less than 40 years later, walked into the White House and asked the President of the United States to punish American factories for buying Japanese machines. It spent 714 pages and $500,000 making the case. The president said no. And within 3 years, the company was gone, broken up, and sold off, its name erased from American business entirely. It did not lose to Japan. It was talked into destroying itself on Wall Street in a deal that had never been tried on a company this size, and then it tried to make the rest of the country pay for the wreckage. This is the story of Houdaille, and it is the blueprint for how a great American company dies. This is Trade Archive. If you want to learn about the machines and the men who built the industrial world, like this video and subscribe. It starts in France with a shudder. In the first decade of the 20th century, the automobile was becoming real, and it rode like a nightmare. Early cars used friction dampers to control their suspension, pads squeezed together to fight the bounce of the road, and they were crude, unpredictable things that gave you a hard ride on a good day and no control on a bad one. A French research engineer named Maurice Houdaille, who had worked at the Rocher-Schneider Motor Works in Lyon, thought there was a better way. He looked at how a hydraulic system could tame a violent motion by forcing fluid through a small opening, and in 1909 he built a shock absorber around that idea. The device was elegant. A sealed cylindrical body filled with oil, bolted to the frame of the car. Inside it, a vane, a paddle, connected by a lever arm to the axle. When the wheel hit a bump and the suspension moved, the lever swung the vane through the oil, and the oil was forced through a tiny orifice. That resistance is what killed the bounce. It resisted a sudden violent movement, but allowed a slow, gentle one, which is exactly what a car needs. It converted the shock of the road into heat, and it did it in both directions, which is why it was called a double-acting damper. On the 1st of March, 1909, Houdaille filed for an American patent. It was granted that September as United States Patent 933076, and it names him plainly a citizen of the French Republic, residing in Paris. Now, there's a legend attached to this invention. You will read that Houdaille invented the recoil system for the famous French 75mm field gun, the artillery piece that hammered the trenches of the First World War. He did not. The recoil mechanism of the French 75 was designed in the 1890s at a government arsenal when Houdaille was a boy. What is true, and what is actually more interesting, is that Houdaille borrowed the principle. He looked at how those guns absorbed the punishment of firing without shaking themselves apart, and he adapted that same idea of controlled hydraulic resistance into something you could bolt onto a Peugeot. During the war, he worked flat out supplying dampers to the French army. He was not a weapons designer. He was the man who took a battlefield principle and put it under the seat of a passenger car, and that is a harder and rarer kind of genius. The invention was good. The problem was that good inventions crossed the Atlantic slowly, and Houdaille needed America. In 1915, a French-born importer in New York named Paul Clodiot recognized what he was looking at and bought the American rights, setting up shop to bring the shock absorber to the United States. But the man who turned it into an industry was in Buffalo. His name was Albert Shultz, an automotive engineer, and in January of 1919, he and his brother incorporated the Houdaille Engineering Corporation. Shultz built the shocks under license in a plant on Buffalo's east side, and for a few years it was a solid, ordinary business. Then, in the autumn of 1927, Henry Ford wrote him a letter. Ford was building the Model A, the car that would put the entire country on wheels, and he wanted Houdaille shock absorbers on every one of them. There was a condition. Ford told Shultz to hire a specific engineer, a 30-year-old named Ralph Pugh, to run the production. Pio was a serious man, a holder of around 150 patents in his lifetime, the inventor of a thermostatically controlled shock absorber and one of the first automobile air conditioners. Shultz hired him. Production doubled, and the company that had been quietly building French dampers in Buffalo was suddenly strapped to the most important car in America. The money moved fast after that. Shultz sold out. The company changed hands twice inside 2 months, and by January of 1929, it had been fused together with 2 other parts makers, Oaks Products and Hershey Manufacturing, into a single enterprise headquartered in Detroit, the Houdaille Hershey Corporation. It made shock absorbers, it made locks, and it made bumpers, those heavy strips of chromed steel that defined the look of the American car, stamped and plated by the million. This is the thing to understand about the company in its prime. It did not sell ideas. It sold physical steel, machined and plated and bolted onto real objects. And it did it so well that ordinary people stopped asking for shock absorbers by their proper name and just asked for a set of Houdailles. And then the government came knocking with a secret. It was the Second World War, and the United States was trying to build an atomic bomb. One of the 2 ways to do it was gaseous diffusion, a process for enriching uranium that involved pushing uranium hexafluoride gas through a barrier riddled with billions of microscopic holes. The problem was chemistry. Uranium hexafluoride is one of the most corrosive substances the human race has ever handled. It ate through ordinary metal. It destroyed the pipes and the pumps, and, worst of all, it destroyed the barrier itself, and without a barrier that could survive the gas, there was no bomb by diffusion. The men solving this needed a manufacturer who understood metal plating at industrial scale, who could deposit and treat nickel with total precision. They needed exactly the kind of expertise that had been chroming Detroit's bumpers for a decade. They came to Houdaille Hershey. The company's plant in Decatur, Illinois, was converted into a secret facility, disguised on the outside as a car parts operation. Inside, it was part of the Manhattan Project. The work centered on the nickel barrier, and it produced one of the tensest engineering decisions of the entire war. A barrier design developed by an inventor named Edward Norris and a chemist named Edward Adler was in production at Decatur. But a rival design had emerged, a competing barrier that the physicist Harold Urey believed was the only one that could produce enough enriched uranium in time to matter. Switching would mean tearing out a nearly finished plant and rebuilding it. Not switching might mean losing the race. The man who had to decide was General Leslie Groves, the brutal, relentless soldier who ran the whole bomb program. In January of 1944, Groves needed to get to Decatur to make the call in person. His train connection fell through in the middle of the night, so he hired a car and a driver and drove through the dark across Indiana and Illinois. And to keep the driver awake at the wheel through the freezing early hours, Groves talked to him the entire way. He arrived at the plant about half an hour late, walked in, and ordered the nearly complete facility stripped and converted to the new barrier. The workers at Decatur, ordinary people from an Illinois factory town, executed the switch. The nickel powder they needed came from a plant in Huntington, West Virginia. By that summer, the barrier material was flowing toward the enrichment plant at Oak Ridge, Tennessee. The uranium that came out the other side went into the weapon. This company, at its peak, was trusted with a piece of the most secret and consequential engineering project in human history. The men in Decatur did not know what they were building. They knew only that the government needed nickel deposited with impossible precision, that the work was urgent, and that they were good enough to be asked. And they delivered. That is who they were. A firm whose plating expertise was so trusted it sat inside the bomb. Now watch who they became. After the war, Houdaille kept growing, and it kept buying. Ralph Pio, the Ford engineer, rose to run the whole thing, moved headquarters to Buffalo, and in the mid-1950s renamed the company Houdaille Industries. By the early 60s, it was a diversified giant, more than $80 million in annual sales, dozens of locations, thousands of shareholders. When Peo stepped back, a corporate attorney named Gerald Saltarelli took the top job, and Saltarelli pushed the company hard into a new field. Machine tools. The machines that make machines. He bought respected names: Powermatic, Acro. And in October of 1965, he bought the crown jewel, a company in California called Burgmaster. Burgmaster mattered because of what it made. It was founded in a Los Angeles garage in the 1940s by an immigrant machinist named Fred Berg, who solved a problem that had slowed metalworking for decades. To drill a series of different holes in a part, an operator used to move the heavy workpiece from one drill press to the next, one machine for each tool. Berg kept the part still and brought the tools to it, mounting them on a rotating turret so an operator could line up the work once and simply spin the next tool into place. One machine did the work of 5. The aerospace shops of Southern California could not get enough of them, and by the mid-60s, Burgmaster was the largest machine tool builder in the American West. That was the crown jewel Houdaille bought in 1965. For a while, the marriage looked good. Houdaille put in capital. Burgmaster built a big modern plant in Gardena, and the machine tool group posted spectacular numbers, and Houdaille climbed the rankings of American toolmakers. But the culture began to change from the moment the deal closed. The intimate shop floor world Berg had built, where the man who ran the company knew the men who ran the machines, was steadily replaced by something colder. Layers of accountants. A production control department that took scheduling authority away from the foreman who actually knew the work. The numbers on the forecast stayed high enough that nobody in headquarters noticed the soul of the place walking out the door. Here's the part almost nobody appreciates. The real threat to Burgmaster showed up before the villains of this story even arrived. Through the 1970s, the machine tool world was shifting under everyone's feet, moving from manual machines to computer numerical control, CNC, machines run by programs instead of by hand. Making that jump required enormous, sustained investment in electronics and software and new manufacturing. And the Japanese were making that jump beautifully. Here's the bitter irony. Burgmaster had actually licensed some of its own technology to Yamazaki years earlier. By the mid-70s, Mazak was building machines barely different from Burgmaster's own and selling them into Burgmaster's own market. A patent fight ended with Mazak agreeing to pay a royalty, but as one Burgmaster executive put it, the damage was already done. The company was falling behind. Then Wall Street arrived. By the late 1970s, Houdaille had a peculiar problem. It was a well-run company with a clean balance sheet, sitting on real assets, and its stock was trading around $14.50 a share, below what the company was actually worth. The economy was mired in stagflation, and the market had no love for old industrial conglomerates. And the very thing that made Houdaille healthy made it a target. Gerald Saltarelli, the man who had built so much of it, hated debt. He said as much, plainly, that debt was anathema to him, that whatever you did, you should do with as little of it as possible. Houdaille carried almost none, which meant that to a certain kind of financier, Houdaille looked like a house with no mortgage on it, just sitting there, waiting to be borrowed against. The financier was a young firm called Kohlberg Kravis Roberts. KKR, Jerome Kohlberg, Henry Kravis, and George Roberts had a mechanism they were refining, a thing called the leveraged buyout. The idea is simple, and the first time you hear it, almost unbelievable. You buy a company, but you do not pay for it with your own money. You borrow the purchase price, and here is the trick. You borrow it against the assets of the company you are buying. The company you are acquiring becomes the collateral for the loan used to acquire it. The company, in effect, is forced to buy itself on credit and then spends years paying off the debt of its own purchase. In May of 1979, KKR took Houdaille Industries private. The price was around $355 million. Shareholders were paid $40 a share, a rich premium over that languishing $14.50. It was the first time this maneuver had ever been pulled on a major public company of this size, and it was the largest of its kind to date. It was a landmark. Wall Street studied it like scripture, and the structure was breathtaking. Of that entire purchase price, the vast majority was debt, raised from banks and insurance companies. KKR's own direct cash contribution to the buyout was reported at around $1 million. $1 million to take control of a company worth hundreds of millions. Jerome Kohlberg became chairman. A man named Philip O'Reilly became chief executive, and he was promised a raise from $110,000 to $200,000 for his trouble. Saltarelli, the debt-hating builder, left with a retirement package reported around $5 million and got out before the bill came due. $1 million of its own money to seize control of a company built over 60 years, a company that had helped enrich the uranium for Hiroshima. The rest was borrowed, and the company itself was on the hook to repay it. The magic of it, the thing that made it work on paper, was the tax code. The interest on all that new debt was deductible. The company could redepreciate its assets. A firm that had been paying millions in federal taxes could suddenly reduce that burden toward nothing and redirect the cash to service the debt. As one Treasury Secretary would later put it, the substitution of deductible interest for taxable income was the mill in which the whole thing was ground. The plan was to pay down the debt over about 5 years and then take the company public again at an enormous profit. And it worked for the investors. Over the following years, Houdaille reportedly returned an average of more than 33% a year to KKR's investors. But a machine tool company is not a spreadsheet. It is a capital-hungry business that survives only by constantly reinvesting in the next generation of technology, and Houdaille had just been buried under a mountain of debt that demanded every spare dollar of cash. This is the part the Wall Street model never accounts for. On the financial statements, a factory looks like an asset that throws off cash. In reality, that cash is not profit. It is the fuel the factory needs to stay competitive, the money that pays for the next machine, the next process, the next generation of engineers. When you divert it to service debt, the balance sheet looks healthy for a few years, while the actual industrial capability quietly dies underneath it. Houdaille's divisions needed to be pouring money into new technology to hold their ground against the Japanese. Instead, every dollar of profit they generated was swept up to headquarters to feed the loan. The company had taken businesses that were already under pressure and removed their last ability to fight back. The clean balance sheet that Saltarelli spent a career building was gone, replaced by a single overriding command that drowned out everything else. Service the debt at all costs. The costs came due first for the workers, and not in California. Up in Oshawa, Ontario, Houdaille ran a bumper plant that had been operating since 1948 and had never once seen a strike. In its own quiet way, it was a model operation. But it made bumpers, and the parent company needed cash, and so in 1980, Houdaille announced the plant would close. The equipment would be pulled out and shipped to South Carolina, a state chosen in part for its hostility to unions. The workers, many of them in their 50s, men who had given their entire adult lives to that plant, were told their pensions would be gutted and their severance would be small. This from a company that had taken a government grant for the plant months earlier, and whose local president was walking away with a retirement payout of his own, north of $1 million. The workers of United Auto Workers Local 222 did not accept it. In August of 1980, around 200 of them seized the plant. They physically occupied it, barred management from removing a single machine, and held it for roughly 2 weeks. They hung Canadian flags out of every window of the building, a factory full of ordinary people staring down a corporation and a continent's worth of finance. Their union director, a tough organizer named Bob White, backed the illegal action and reportedly told nervous union leadership that they could not worry about lawsuits right now, and warned that if anyone tried to break the occupation, he would empty out the region's giant General Motors plants in response. The occupation held. The workers forced Houdaille back to the table and won real improvements, better severance, early retirement for the long-service men. The plant still closed in the end. But the fight in Oshawa helped push the province of Ontario to strengthen its laws on mass layoffs, advance notice, and pension protection. The workers lost the factory and won something that outlived it. Houdaille, meanwhile, had shown its hand. Under the debt, it would take whatever it had to take from whoever it could take it from. And back in Gardena, it was taking the one thing a machine tool company cannot afford to lose: its integrity. This is the darkest chapter. Under relentless pressure to generate cash to feed the debt and to book revenue before the end of each fiscal quarter, Burgmaster's management began forcing machines out the door before they were finished. Skilled machinists, men who had spent decades learning to build a tool right, were ordered to ship equipment they knew was defective. Machines went to customers accompanied by long lists of things that field service would have to come and fix later. The company promised buyers features that its own engineers had not even finished designing. A crude, poorly suited computer scheduling system made the chaos worse. And for the men on that floor, the ones Fred Berg had built a culture around, being ordered to put their name on garbage and send it to a customer was a specific kind of humiliation. This is where the reputation died. A Burgmaster machine had once meant reliability. Now it meant a 2-page list of defects and a service call. American shops discovered they could buy a Japanese machine that arrived and simply worked for less money, and they did exactly that in droves. When the machine stopped selling, Philip O'Reilly did not look in the mirror. He looked to Washington, and he did something no one had ever done. In May of 1982, Houdaille filed a petition with the Reagan administration. It was 714 pages long. The legal fees alone ran around $500,000, spent by a company that could barely afford it, and it was driven by a determined attorney named Richard Kopakin. Now, a company that believes it is being harmed by unfair foreign competition normally goes to the International Trade Commission, files an anti-dumping case, and submits to public hearings and a rigorous burden of proof. Houdaille did not do that, and the reason it did not is the tell. Its own financial mismanagement would never have survived that kind of scrutiny. So instead, Kopakin reached for an obscure, dusty piece of law that had never once been used, Section 103 of the Revenue Act of 1971. This provision let the president, by his own authority, deny the investment tax credit to American companies that bought equipment from a country engaged in unfair trade. Read that carefully, because it is the whole scandal in one sentence. Houdaille was not asking to be helped. It was asking the president to punish American manufacturers, to raise the cost of the better Japanese machines they wanted to buy, so that those American manufacturers would be herded back into buying Houdaille's inferior ones. This is rent-seeking in its purest possible form. A company that could no longer win in the market, asking the government to break the market on its behalf. The petition told a lurid story. It alleged that Japan's Ministry of International Trade and Industry had organized the machine tool builders into a cartel, propped up with subsidies and cheap loans. It even claimed some of the money came from a cut of the betting at Japanese bicycle and motorcycle racetracks, an off-budget slush fund funneled to machinery makers. The Japanese government acknowledged that some racetrack money had historically reached industry, but insisted the amounts were tiny. And here it is, worth being honest, as Holland himself was. The evidence that Japan won through some grand conspiracy was thin. The Japanese firms mostly won because they built better, cheaper, more reliable machines. The cartel story was an advocacy weapon, not a settled fact. The petition landed in Washington like a grenade and split the Reagan cabinet down the middle. On one side, the trade hawks, who saw it as useful leverage against a Japan that seemed to be eating American industry alive and who were happy to make an example. On the other, the free market economists, who pointed out the obvious insanity of the request. Punishing your own manufacturers for buying good, cheap equipment does not make them stronger. It makes them slower and poorer, and it hands the advantage to every foreign competitor who is not being taxed for buying the best machines available. The argument went back and forth inside the administration for the better part of a year, and the fight climbed all the way to the top, because it had stopped being about one machine tool company and become about the entire economic relationship between the United States and Japan at the height of the Cold War. Japan's Prime Minister, Yasuhiro Nakasone, came to Washington and met with Reagan personally in early 1983. Reagan needed Nakasone. He needed the alliance, the bases, the partnership against the Soviet Union. And here was an obscure tax petition from a failing conglomerate threatening to blow a hole in all of it. O'Reilly, for his part, spent months in Washington stumping for his cause, trying to start a trade war to save his company's pot of gold. It failed. On the night of Friday, the 22nd of April, 1983, the administration announced that the president had denied the petition. No elaborate public reasoning, just no. The obscure law stayed dusty. Houdaille had spent $500,000 in months of its chief executive's time trying to legislate away the consequences of its own buyout, and it had lost. After that, the collapse was only a matter of arithmetic. The debt did not care that the petition had failed. In September of 1985, Houdaille announced a restructuring, and the Burgmaster plant closure was announced that October. In January of 1986, the contents of the Gardena plant were auctioned off. And on that auction floor, among the equipment, sat small turret-head machines that turned out, on inspection, to be Japanese. The company that had begged the president to punish Americans for buying Japanese tools had been quietly buying them itself. Houdaille itself did not last much longer. In 1987, KKR ran a second buyout to cash out the original investors, pushed O'Reilly into retirement, and shortly after sold the whole enterprise to a British firm, the TI Group. TII kept the one genuinely profitable piece, a division called John Crane that made industrial seals, and the rest was broken up and folded away. The name Houdaille, which had once meant the shock absorbers under half the cars in America, and a secret role in the atomic bomb, simply vanished from American business. And it did not vanish alone. Across those same years, roughly a third of the machine tool plants in the United States disappeared, and the country fell from dominance in the master tools of all industry to somewhere near the middle of the pack. So here is the verdict, and it is worth stating plainly, because the whole point of this story is that the easy explanation is a lie. It would be comfortable to say that Japan killed the American machine tool industry, that superior foreign competition simply won. And Japanese firms were superior, and they did win their share of the market fairly. But Houdaille's divisions were already under pressure before KKR ever arrived, and the company was buried for good, not by Tokyo, but by a financial structure invented on Wall Street, one that took a firm with no debt and a secret role in building the atomic bomb and turned it into a vehicle whose only purpose was to service the loan used to buy it. And that is why this story matters far beyond one vanished company. The Houdaille buyout was the first of its kind on a company that size, and Wall Street did not treat it as a cautionary tale. It treated it as a proof of concept. The same maneuver, borrowing against a healthy company's own assets to buy it, stripping its cash to service the debt, and cashing out before the damage came due, would be run again and again across American industry through the 1980s and beyond. Houdaille was the template. When its executives finally could not make the numbers work, they did not accept the consequences. They tried to weaponize the United States government against their own customers. And when that failed, they padlocked the doors and walked away from the wreckage with their retirement packages intact. The greatest threat to American manufacturing in those years did not sail across the Pacific. It was invented in a boardroom, and it wore a very respectable suit. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the machines, the men, and the exact mechanism of how empires like this one are built and broken, subscribe to Trade Archive. There are more of these stories than you would believe.